Jamuted. Jabated. How y'all doing? Chat? What is, something feels off. Hold on. Okay. Jamuted. Jabated by Jamuted. So welcome everyone to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything we're talking about today is educational or entertaining. And if y'all have a question or concern that's medical in nature, clinical in nature, please go see a licensed professional. So a couple of things. So the final dopamine detox session is this Friday at 11 a.m. Central. Is that over now? Today's Friday, right? Am I losing that? So maybe it's already over? I don't know. If you spend too much time on video games, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, etc., feel free to tune in. I recently heard actually that one piece of feedback we got is one person was like literally said that this literally changed their life. So, you know, it's a community-driven event and is sort of, you know, people working together to develop a healthier relationship with technology. A couple of other things. So we've seen a lot of discussion and feedback in the community about what we do here at HG. So we're actually going to be releasing a video about ethics, what we do at HG, and all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully that video will come out on Sunday. So stay tuned to that. 1 second. Okay. So yeah, so a couple of announcements. And yeah, so I think today we're going to cover a couple of posts. So I'm really, really excited about the posts we're going to be talking about today. One is kind of career oriented. So we see this a lot. It actually almost builds on Wednesday's stream. The second thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is like the world and, you know, kind of how the world seems to be moving in the wrong direction and what you can kind of do about that. And then if we have time, we'll also talk a little bit about growing up, falling behind, feeling like you're behind, feeling like you're too old, feeling like someone made a post recently about, you know, feeling like they're a child trapped in an adult's body. So, you know, so hopefully some kind of career-oriented stuff. And the approach we're going to take is also going to be somewhat like mental in nature. So how can we understand our sense of identity, what we take pride in, how, you know, what we find difficult to deal with. And yeah, so we'll kind of dive into that. Other things, so I'm level 43 or 44 in Lost Ark. And so maybe next week, if we have time, we can maybe play some Lost Ark or more importantly, Elden Ring. So I'm like really, really looking forward to that. By the way, like are people playing Lost Ark? People playing? So can I ask y'all some questions about this? So first thing is like, do I need to be doing like all of this other stuff or can I just level up? Do y'all know this? Like, do I need to be collecting Makoko seeds and like doing rapport and okay, like because there's tons of stuff. Like there's like stronghold stuff. There's like boats, right? You know, and I can't tell if it's okay. So I should just be loud because I'm like sort of ignoring that. Like I'll do what I think is fun. Like sometimes I even think like mining things and crafting things in games is like kind of fun, right? It's kind of like managing your stronghold is sort of neat. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of a game called Timberborn, but I tried playing Timberborn a couple of weeks ago and I thought it was super cool. And when was the last time I played an MMO? Oh my God. So I tried playing a little bit of FF14. So I leveled a character to 50. And then I think I like came back and I did like Crystal Tower or something. Like, but I missed the FF14 boat. That's actually why I'm playing Lost Ark. Because like I've heard that FF14, it was one of the most epic. Oh, let's see. One of the most. Okay, so it seems like most people don't play Lost Ark. I guess we have a bunch of healthy gamers here who are steering clear of MMOs. So like I kind of missed actually the MMO boat or train or whatever. So like I played WoW, right? Like leveled to 60, played like a little bit of Blackwing Lair and Molten Core, and then played a little bit of Burning Crusade, like leveled to 70, and then did a couple of instances. But I was just kind of like busy at that point. It was like, so WoW was in its heyday when I was like studying to become a monk and stuff. So kind of steered clear of that stuff. And then FF14, I also kind of leveled up, but then quickly got left behind because, you know, real life stuff like being in med school and then like having kids and things like that. And so I sort of have missed the boat on this like MMO experience, which is fine, right? So like this is the other thing is a lot of people like, oh my God, this game is coming out. I can't miss it. It's like, yeah, you can. There's going to be another MMO after that, right? I missed the boat on WoW, missed the boat on FF14. Would it have been epic? Apparently, like, absolutely. So maybe there won't be another MMO on the caliber of FF14. Who knows? But that's okay, right? Because there's going to be, like, other stuff that is epic and iconic that happens. Like, in the heyday of gaming, I played a lot of Super Mario 64. Like, that game blew my mind. And I don't know if y'all have played Super Mario 64 or not, but it's like, it's amazing. And then, you know, you also have your old loves, right? So I play a little bit of the Dota from time to time, which, by the way, super excited about NA regional qualifiers that start in, I think, 3 hours. So we got to wrap up stream because Dr. K has to watch some Dota. Yeah. A new patch. Oh, new Dota patch, right? Yeah, finally. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, Yeah, we've streamed Dota from time to time, so we may stream some gaming. Like I don't know. I mean, you know, people here seem to be okay. Like we did a poll last I think on Wednesday. Are y'all okay if I actually stream gaming from time to time? And I think like 90% of people are like, yeah. And I think people are okay with that. But then sometimes like when it actually happens, people like come in and are, like I've noticed because I'll be watching chat. I actually interact with chat more when I'm gaming. But sometimes chat will be kind of disappointed, right? Because like sometimes people are like here to like learn something. And if it's just like Dr. K like planting wards on high ground, like running up into high ground without vision to plant a ward and getting owned by a carry who's farming ancients, like that's not really what you came here to see, right? Or is it? I don't know. Yeah, so we'll see. In WoW, I played primarily a warlock. And in Lost Ark, I'm playing a Sork. So, what is this between two ferns? I wish. Dude, if only I was that brilliant. How often do I play per week? Honestly, on average, I probably play between 2 and 6 hours of games per week. Like, on average. But that tends to be, like, 0 to 2 some weeks and, like, way more. So I looked today. I played 16 hours of Lost Ark in the last 7 days, right? So that comes out to almost 2 hours a day, but that's like, this is the most I've gamed in like months, years even. I don't think I've played a game this seriously in years. Yeah, I mean, you'll say fake gamer. I mean, so here's the thing. I clocked in plenty of hours in my 20s, right? I clocked in enough hours for a lifetime in my 20s. But you know, so I think it's like gaming is something that you can enjoy from time to time, right? Okay, shall we get started? All right, let's take a look. Okay, I used to be successful, and now I'm not. So I feel absolutely shattered. I'm 28 years old, and it's like my career peaked 5 years ago. From ages of 23 to 25, I got articles published in the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, and Los Angeles Times, signed a book deal, and had a job writing a politics newsletter for 30,000 subscribers working 3 blocks from the White House. Now I struggle to make $20K a year and can't find anyone willing to hire me. The company I worked for went under in 2017, and we were all laid off. I took some remote writing jobs, but they weren't a fit. Experimented with being a professional poker player for a while, and now here I am trying to get back into the job market and can't seem to break through. I submit job applications like it's a full-time job. I've gotten a few interviews and really close to certain positions, but they always seem to pick a different candidate at the final round. My self-esteem is rapidly diminishing. I used to feel like I was unique and had a lot to offer. My whole life, people told me I had all these talents and gifts, sounding familiar, chat, but I'm left feeling entirely unwanted by the professional world. I'm starting to seriously question if it was all a lie. If I'm so special, why can't I even get an email back? Emails, emails, emails. All I do is send emails. I'm getting cynical and sad. Starting to feel like the job market is a gamified scam like dating apps, promising connections but mostly resulting in poor, superficial matches, and the only ones that work out are dumb luck. I'm actually married now, but all these job rejections remind me of the misery and rejections of dating apps I used to experience. One of us has got to be in the wrong here. Either A, the job market can't seem to recognize me as a motivated, intelligent candidate, or B, I'm not nearly as special or accomplished as I thought I was, and this rejection is completely deserved. Professionally speaking, I am worthless. So I don't know if this is option B or this is a conclusion. So this is unfortunately something that actually happens a lot to people. So we've talked about gifted kids, right? So we've talked about people who are told from a young age that they're gifted and talented. And oftentimes what we find is that gifted kids run into a wall. And when they run into a wall, they really start to struggle because their whole sense of identity is built off of being gifted. And how do people tell them that they're gifted? Why do people tell them that they're gifted? Well, that's because, you know, It's usually due to performance. So like when I write, the best essay in the class in the 7th grade, someone tells me, wow, you were a really talented writer. And so I think, oh, okay, so like my value as a human being is because I'm gifted, and I'm gifted because I'm a talented writer. And then that kind of perpetuates, right? In 9th grade, I write another really good essay as well. I'm gifted, I'm gifted, I'm gifted. And then even sometimes with gifted kids, they start to flounder a little bit in let's say high school because they haven't developed study habits, because they are actually like very talented or very intelligent or something like that. So you don't develop the supporting skills, which means that at some point you like hit a wall, because either you can jump right over it or you kind of run into it because you never learned how to climb, right? So it's either like a full clear or like a full stop. And so that's where sometimes like we run into problems in high school. That's where I started to have problems. I certainly had problems in college and had to like learn how to study and apply myself. And then we also see this kind of situation where people, do really good, and then they may go to college and do well in college. And then they like in their first phase of their professional career, they get like a lot of really prestigious things, right? So Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, LA Times, signed a book deal, working 3 days, 3 blocks from the White House. And so then sometimes what happens is that these people too, so now like you sort of get that you're gifted, right? Look at the world, look at the accolades that I have. That's how I know that I have value. And then if something goes wrong, like, if the company goes under in 2017, and then what happens is like, since your sense of identity is built up through being gifted, talented, and your accolades, the moment your accolades go away, the moment your accomplishments go away, your self-esteem goes with it. So this, unfortunately, is a all too common experience, and it absolutely sucks to go through. And the good news is that like, just because you have been successful in the past and are now hitting a wall does not mean that you don't have value, does not mean that you aren't brilliant. The reason that we feel this way is because our determination of our brilliance is based on external factors, right? So like our sense of our value as a human being is based on the kind of rewards that the world gives us. And so if you're in this kind of situation, this is actually a really, really good opportunity to like grow as a person and really start to figure out like who you are and what you can be proud of that is independent of what the rest of the world appreciates. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about this situation and sort of like go into more detail, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is talk a little bit about the psychology of like what's going on with self-esteem, right? So I sort of explained some of it now. So we're going to talk a little bit about like how do we build ourselves up? Where does self-esteem come from? How is it reinforced? And then sometimes if our karma, if our circumstances change, how that can pull the rug out from under our self-esteem. And then if that situation happens where things aren't hunky-dory, everything isn't fantastic now, how can you start to go about the process of like getting your self-esteem back? And how can you start the process of exploring where self-esteem truly comes from? Because self-esteem does not come from the Washington Post, does not come from the LA Times, does not come from working 3 blocks from the White House. Self-esteem comes from the self. The problem is that this person does not have self-esteem, they have esteem. They have external esteem, right? So how do we start to work on our self-esteem? The last thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about, and this is something that our community has been increasingly both asking for and also appreciating, is some practical tips, right? So if we look at this post for a moment, there's a lot of like really practical stuff here. So like emails, emails, emails. So either the job market can't seem to recognize me as a motivated, intelligent candidate, or I'm not as accomplished or special as I thought. So like we're going to talk actually a little bit about practicalities of like what does the job market actually look for, right? And if you are someone who is talented and has a real contribution to make, does the job market actually care about that? Like when you're sending out thousands of emails to companies that are getting thousands of applications, do they really care about whether you're talented, gifted, brilliant? Are they even giving you a fair shake on that? And what do employers actually look for? Like what's the purpose of a job application? And so I'd like to end with a couple of almost practical tips, right? So how can you kind of start with psychology and then like apply that to the practical steps that you're going to take going forward. Okay, so let's get started. So, does that sound good? Okay. So, we're going to start with sort of like the psychology of esteem. Okay, so let's go here. So let's talk about the psychology of esteem. So we kind of went through this a little bit, kind of as sort of a spoiler alert, but here's the first thing to understand. So our sense of self-worth comes from two places. It can come from the outside or from the inside. And the interesting thing is, if you look at things like attachment theory, the really interesting thing is that originally when we're very young, our internal sense of self-worth actually comes from the outside. And this is like when we're super young, like, you know, because a child doesn't really know what is an accomplishment and what is not an accomplishment. So the way that we're treated, the way that we're valued will sort of determine our sense of esteem. So for example, some children are given conditional love. So what this sort of means is like the love and support and reinforcement that I get actually has to do with like my performance, right? So if I perform, I'm loved and I'm valued and I'm respected. And some kids are given unconditional love. And this is where like we can still appreciate performance, but the value that you bring as a human being is actually transcendent beyond your performance. So I'll give you all just we have transcendent value. So I'll give you all just a simple example, right? So, oh, you did such a great job. I'm so proud of you. That's awesome. I love it when you get A's. You're the smartest kid in the class. You're so gifted. You're so awesome. So your value is based on getting an A, being gifted, being talented, etc. So we see this a lot with gifted kids. The next thing, like let's kind of use a different example of unconditional love, right? Which is like, let's say I get a B. So in the case of a gifted kid, like, why didn't you get an A? You need to study harder. You need to work harder. You need to stop playing video games. It's important to get an A, get an A, get an A, get an A. Whereas if we have sort of a situation where we have unconditional love, it's like, it's okay to make mistakes and we care about you anyway, right? So it's sort of like saying like your value as a human being doesn't matter. Like whether you get an A or a B, I love you either way. I really hope that you can study a little bit harder. I'm going to try to help you, right? It's not just your fault that you got a B. As a parent, I recognize that like if there's something that you're not able to do, maybe I have a hand in that. And so I sort of, because here's the thing, when it comes to gifted kids in conditional love, the success or failure is all theirs, right? They own it all. It's your responsibility. There's a lot of self-reliance on improvement. So if it's a success, it's your success, but if it's a failure, it's your failure. Whereas in the cases of unconditional love, hopefully you'll have parents who will sort of share responsibility with you, right? Hey, it's not all your fault. It's not like you're an idiot because you got a B. Maybe I need to be doing better as a parent. Maybe I need to make sure that you're doing your homework. Maybe I need to teach you something. Maybe I need to talk to you about why school is hard. And when you say all of those things to a child, what the child sort of recognizes is that the problem is not just here, right? There are all kinds of these things like study habits, parental support. And the more that parents sort of acknowledge that this is responsible for outcomes, the easier it is to be assured of who you are on the inside, right? This is a problem that can be fixed. It's not intrinsic value based on like whether you got an A or a B. So this is how things start. So we'll sort of, some people will be raised this way. Some people will be raised predominantly this way. It's like oftentimes both, right? But there's like, it tends to be a mix of it. And then when we sort of end up with conditional love, and by the way, there's a whole video about that in Dr. K's guide, if y'all are interested, the problem of conditional love. Then what happens is that we tend to be a little bit performance oriented. Right? So we can work hard, we can be motivated, right? Because my value as a human being depends on my performance. So in order to feel good, I need to get an A, right? So when we sort of, so people will be very, very motivated. They'll actually be very successful in the case of conditional love. Because like, just think about it for a second. In the case of conditional love, whether you get love or not is conditional. And do you want love? Do you need love? Is it a basic human need? Absolutely. So I'm going to try my level best to meet those requirements, right? So these people tend to be very performance oriented, and then like this can escalate. So it starts with A's, and then it's Wall Street Journal, then it's book deal, right? So each of these things that happen, and we can even look at this post. When this person talks about, their value as a human being, they don't say, I wrote some really brilliant articles. They don't say, I wrote some stuff that is like beautiful prose. I did some awesome investigative journalism. I did some amazing political analysis, right? So they don't actually talk about the value of their work. Do y'all see that? What they talk about is the accolades of their work. So there's no intrinsic value. It's about how the value was received. And once you do that, then suddenly this is not about what you wrote, right? It's how the world received what you wrote. So then what happens is your esteem is based on external factors. And so what does that mean for us, right? That means that if the world stops loving us, or we stop getting like positive reinforcement from the world, our esteem is going to go from it because our esteem is not internal. It's not self-esteem, it's external esteem. Right? So like I'll give you all just a quick example. So let's say that, a lot of people are concerned about the way they look and how comfortable they are in their body. So, and a lot of that is determined, it's not actually like how comfortable you are in your body and how okay you are with your appearance. People may assume for a moment that that comfort depends on how people treat you. So if people call you beautiful, like surely that person will be more confident. The truth of the matter is that that's not actually the case, right? That you can have beautiful people who are comfortable in their body, and you can have beautiful people who are insecure about their looks. And the insecure people require external validation, right? So some like models, for example, male or female or non-binary or whatever, like they will require constant validation from partners, friends, whatever, about how amazing they look. And the reason that they do that is because their sense of like pride in their appearance actually comes from the external world. Because you'll have some people who are pretty average looking who are actually like pretty content with the way they look, right? They don't actually need external validation to make them comfortable in their own skin. They recognize I'm not the most beautiful person on the planet. I'm not the ugliest person on the planet. I do what I can. I get my hair done well. I try to exercise. I try to, buy clothing that's flattering. Like I'm going to like groom myself properly. And like, I'm never going to be a supermodel, and that's okay. Right? So confidence is not actually about the way the world treats you. And the problem is that if you're someone who is grown up gifted, if you're someone who has performed, and then the world stops giving you validation, then there's a crisis of confidence. And that crisis of confidence is characterized by a loss of self-esteem. But once again, it's not self-esteem, right? It's a loss of esteem. And this is where, the real antidote is to start to develop self-esteem. And we'll get to the how in a second. I recognize it's not just develop self-esteem, chat. So, and here's the thing that I want to point out is that this person, why doesn't this person have self-esteem? It's because they've never needed it, right? So like our body doesn't, my biceps aren't just like ripped because I'm sitting around clicking the mouse. My biceps grow when I like exercise with them, right? So when I lift against a resistance, my body adapts by growing the muscle. And our esteem is the same way. So as long as you've gotten like a lot of esteem from the external world, you will never need to have developed self-esteem, right? And so like this isn't an issue of like you're a bad person or you're a good person or you're, professionally worthless. Like that's not what it's about. It's just simply that thus far in your life, you haven't really needed to develop self-esteem because you've gotten plenty of esteem from the outside world. So your brain and your body are very, very economical. So they're not going to like waste time developing things that are unused, right? So you think about a child who's learning a language. Like learning your first language is incredibly critical because you need to be able to communicate. But once you like learn a language, it's not like your brain is struggling to learn a second language, right? Because now your needs are met. And if your needs are met, there's no point in changing anything. So then the question becomes, how do I start to develop self-esteem? And so this is where I want to point out like a couple of things that you can sort of do. The first is to, track back to where does your esteem truly come from? And so what I would ask this person is like, when you were riding high, what were you proud of? How did you know that you were doing a good job? And I know it sounds kind of weird, but even that exploration, that acknowledgement of like, what made you proud? What made you know that you could bring value to the world? Was it what you wrote or the fact that you were writing for the Wall Street Journal? Right? And the more that you sort of start to ask, like, where did I derive value? Because here's the key thing. So at the age of 23 to 25, Wall Street Journal, White House, LA Times, right? And then let's say 26 to 28, I think they are now, right? How old are they? 28, yeah. Okay. So from 26 to 28, none of those things. So here's the thing. If you want to build self-esteem here, let's say that your goal is to build self-esteem going forward. This is actually not the right place to start because the lack of self-esteem actually started here, right? This is where you determined what your esteem was based on. So a lot of people will say like, okay, in the present, right? So we advocate for doing stuff in the present, like we teach meditation and stuff. So you can do all that stuff by all means. We've gone into ahamkar and identity and like how to discover who you truly are and stuff like that. But I think the other thing, so we're going to add on to that today. The other thing is that you have to go back to the past and try to figure out like, where did I build my self-esteem? Because oddly enough, what you need to do is deconstruct your esteem from here, right? Because as long as your esteem is determined by external things, like there's not space for you to develop self-esteem. So oftentimes when I work with people, and I saw this a lot, at different institutions that are like very, very high performing, right? So like investment banks, private equity firms, like places like Goldman Sachs and stuff like that. I'd have clients from those kinds of places. And what I sort of discover is that the way that, and they would be like 30, let's say, and they're coming in and they have a crisis of confidence because they just got fired for the first time in their life. And they went to Yale and then they got an MBA from Yale and then they went to, Wharton for some other thing. And then like, so it's just like success through and through. And then at 30, they get fired for the first time or they get a bad performance review or they don't get promoted. And then they're like spinning in the wind. And the solution is to actually go back and actually deconstruct where your esteem originally came from, right? And this is where you want to ask yourself, like, where does my value come from here? And hopefully what you can discover is that it's not the LA Times that made you good, right? The LA Times may be a seal of approval, absolutely, but that's all it is, right? It's not the real value. The real value is in what you wrote. So like the reason that the LA Times is publishing your stuff, it's not the LA Times that makes you good. It's because you are good that the LA Times will publish your stuff. It's not, the accolades are not the reason you are good. They're a consequence of you are good. So this is where we're going to talk for a second about karma or karma, right? So what comes first? The LA Times into the good writing or the good writing into the LA Times? And this comes first. So what part are you responsible for? You're responsible for this, right? So absolutely, like once you start writing for the LA Times, maybe you get better and you have good editors and stuff like that and you improve. So there's like some amount of reciprocal stuff, right? But like the reason that you made it there is because you were writing really well. Like and sure, there's like a stepwise kind of thing where you did good in English class, right? English honors, and then journalism at Columbia. And then you wrote your first piece for the HuffPo. And then you wrote your next piece for the New York Times. And you improved over time, like absolutely. right? And did the New York Times look at your writing because you had written for HuffPo? Sure. But here's the thing, they may have looked at it, but the writing had to be good. Like the New York Times is not going to publish you just because you wrote for HuffPo. The reason that the New York Times is going to publish you is because like you wrote something good. And so the truth is the more that you tunnel down into how the world gives you accolades, the more hopefully you come to the conclusion, this is where I really encourage you to think about it. Are you actually a good writer? Even if you come to the answer no, what I'll oftentimes see with people that I've worked with is, okay, let's get better. Right? Because I know, are you a good writer? And so sometimes people will come to this kind of conclusion. They're like, actually, no, I'm not a good writer, but I have written well in the past. And that's even healthier. Like you can't be a good writer or a bad writer. Like the truth is that I am capable of writing well. And the neat thing is once you adopt that attitude, it's like, okay, how do I get there again? What did I do when I was writing for the LA Times? How can I get better at this? And so this all moves towards an action orientation, a growth mindset. We've sort of talked a little bit about that on Wednesday, right? So y'all can watch those VODs and stuff if you want to. And the last thing that I kind of want to point out, and this is why I'm sort of bringing up karma, is that now this person is in a situation where let's assume for a moment they're capable of writing well. Right? And so if people are not hiring you, does that mean I am bad? So I want y'all to think about this for a second. Let's say I am a gardener, okay? And I'm really good at gardening. I'm a skilled gardener. And then what I have over here is very fertile soil, right? So a lot of good soil. And then what I have over here is a barren desert. Feeling Minecraftish today with rocks. Okay? So let's say that these are the two options. My skill at gardening is the same. When I plant seeds over here, they turn into plants. When I plant seeds over here, doesn't matter how many I plant, don't turn into anything. So what does that say about my skill as a gardener? Right? So maybe even I'm really good, I can get a little bit of a plant here. But this is the key thing that we sometimes forget, right? Is that all we're entitled to as human beings are our actions. And our outcomes don't necessarily determine our skill. So if you're like working in an environment where it sounds like this person was at a company until 2017, everyone was laid off, right? So like, let's just think about that for a second. Like, it sounds like the company was doing well, but everyone got laid off. So there may be like industry-wide changes that affected journalism. So I think journalism has been on the struggle bus for a while, right? As an industry. So like this used to be the thing where the New York Times would like have subscriptions to the newspaper. So they had like revenue because people needed to read the newspaper. And along came the internet and like now things are behind paywalls and like, people used to have subscriptions, but I don't know how many people have subscriptions to the New York Times anymore. And so with things like the internet and the free availability of information and the transition to advertising and stuff like that, like the whole industry got changed. And so this company went under in 2017. And so then things changed. So this is where you need to be careful. So now we're going to kind of get to the practical side of things. The first thing is so do all this stuff by all means, but then also recognize that just because you're not getting a job doesn't mean that you're bad at what you do, right? This has nothing to do with esteem. There are karmic industry-wide phenomenon that may be happening, which are essentially moving you in this direction as opposed to this direction. Now, if the gardener works over here for a while, is not careful, they will conclude that they are a bad gardener, which may not be correct, right? It may not be fair. Doesn't mean that there aren't things you can work on. So now what we're going to sort of do, so I just want to set that frame because I think this is really, really important, that your value doesn't necessarily have to do with the way that the world treats you. And this is where the person says, like, I can't tell if I'm a talented writer or not, right? So let's kind of just look at that for a second. Oh, so let's look over here. So getting cynical and sad, either the job market can't seem to recognize me as a motivated, intelligent candidate, or I'm not nearly as special or accomplished as I thought, right? Like either the world can't see what I have to offer, or I don't have anything to offer, which makes perfect sense, right? It's a very good question. So let's talk a little bit about that. So like when you're emailing, this is what you do all day, every day. What do people look for? Right? So do emails and like submitting resumes and stuff, like, does that look for brilliance? Right? So like when we do paper applications, so let's think a little bit about, it sounds like this person is emailing. So I'm assuming they're applying to online jobs. And what do y'all think an online employer is looking for? Right? So this is where, as a society, as we become more outcome oriented, which isn't necessarily bad, right? There are advantages and disadvantages. What we've started to do is use proxies for talent or skill. Because we don't have, like, so here's the thing. I'm going to post a job. I'm going to get 2,000 applications. I don't have time to read 2,000 pieces of writing. So what I'm going to do is start to use substitutes, start to use correlates. Which school did you go to? Where have you written in the past? You know? So I'm going to use all these correlates for brilliance. Because when you apply for a job, no one ever, like if I'm applying to be like an engineer, no one asks how much engineering do you know, right? I mean, they may ask in later forms of the interview, but like generally speaking, at the application phase, like no one is like, do you understand engineering? That's not a part of the job interview. It's like, where have you worked before? What was your GPA? Where did you go to school? And we use all of those as proxies for skill. So in this person's case, like let's try to think a little bit about why this person may be running into problems. Okay. New York Times, LA Times, HuffPo. Professional poker player. Right? So like imagine you're an employer. Let's compare you to person number 2. Let's say San Antonio Chronicle. Let's say, what's another? Florida Gazette. And let's say HuffPo. Who are you going to hire? Right? It's like, what are you getting here? So this person made it to final round interviews, so I'm also curious a little bit about the numbers game, because this is the other thing to understand about online employers. It's just a numbers game, right? So if I have like 50 applicants for one position, like what is the percentage chance that I get a job offer? It's like raw, it's like 2%, right? I have 50 applicants. But here's the thing. If we look at a list of candidates that go from 50 to 1, it's not like each of these people gets one application, right? The person who's at the top of the list is going to get like 80% invitations, and the person at the bottom of the list is going to get 0%. And so as this person gets a job, then number 49 will have an 80%, and then number 48 will have an 80%. Right? And so he goes out, and then he goes out or she goes out. And so it's not like actually probabilistically even across the spread, because invitations get given to the people at the top of the list. And so the fact that the person has gotten a couple of interviews tells me that this person should keep applying, because like once you get to the interview stage, then you know you're actually like a good applicant. When people are interviewing you, that means that what you have on your resume is sufficient for us to hire you. Now we're going to try to get a feel for who you are. And this is where the psychology comes back in. Because when you are this, and when you are concerned about this, when this is what's in your head, when this is what's in your head, when this is what's in your head, how strong do you think you interview? Right? So what is the purpose of an interview? We talked about emails for a second. This is something that I don't know that people have kind of explained. So oftentimes interviews are sort of about, they're kind of like skills assessments in a sense. Right? So it's like, it's a skills assessment. Let's see how brilliant you are. But that's not just what interviews are about. Interviews are incredibly limbic. They're incredibly empathic and incredibly like subsurface brain stuff. Right? It's not like consciously. It's like you're going to meet people. You're like, yeah, I liked that guy. All right, yeah, she was super cool. They were really awesome. What is that? What are people picking up? Would that person be fun to work with? So I remember when I was training in residency, like we would have medical students rotate through. So these were audition rotations. So people wanted to do residency, at this hospital. So people would like come and they'd like audition for a month and they'd come and work there. And some of them were like brilliant on paper. And then like you work with them and it's sort of like, I remember asking questions, like my colleagues and I would ask questions to each other. And it's like, would you want to be supervising this person overnight on call? And for some people, despite the fact that they were absolutely brilliant on paper, the answer was absolutely not. This person would be a nightmare to work with. Right? So that's where like, understand that, I know it sounds kind of weird, but like interviews are not just skills assessments. There's some weird emotional limbic kind of stuff going on. And that's where, so people may say like, okay, then am I screwed? And the answer is no, absolutely not. You're not screwed because all you have to do is like do this stuff, right? You have to start to think through and recognize that actually you bring value to the table. If you, like, you can't fake, maybe you can fake one article for the Huffington Post. But if you've written for the LA Times, New York Times, Huffington Post, and had a political newsletter that had 30,000 subscribers, there's something absolutely legitimate to what you bring to the table. And if you cannot access that in an interview, then your chances of interviewing are going to be like lower, right? So you can kind of fake it till you make it. But I think the really awesome thing would be like, if you can really dig down and do the psychological work before you go into the interview and recognize that, oh, like this is actually my situation. That I'm actually a brilliant gardener and that, I had really, really fertile fields before and now it's like kind of barren. Like I struggled for a little bit, right? And that's okay. So this is the kind of thing where I would say like even in interviews, like I don't know what this person says when they ask them like, what have you been doing for the last 4 years? And they're like, yeah, I tried being a professional poker player. And so then this is where you could sort of say something like, I'd own it and I'd say something like, so I wrote for the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera. Like I really enjoyed that kind of thing. And then I tried doing some freelance writing. But what I really realized is that like I love writing collaboratively. Like I can write, but in terms of what really gets me excited and what allows me to write pieces that are incredibly compelling, that move people is when I'm working with a team or in some kind of environment that's like better structured like the New York Times or whatever. You make that up. And what I'm really looking for is that kind of environment. Because that's what allows me to write at my highest level. And when you say something like that, like someone's across the other side of the table, it's like, that's pretty good, right? You have to be able to authentically own it. So I don't think you should lie. Everyone's saying just lie. No, don't lie. Like this is why you do the introspective work so that you can say something authentically, right? And when you say something authentically, what it's going to access is this weird like limbic stuff. And when you can own it, you're like, yeah, I tried some other stuff for a while, but what I really discovered is I truly love writing and I miss writing. And this is actually what I want to do for the rest of my life. And when you can own that, right, that's what you should say. So it's not just lie. What you should do is say whatever you can own through the introspective process. Okay? Right? So there are a couple of other things to just consider before we kind of wrap up. One is, so I would also do a couple of things. One is get feedback. This is really important. So if you're like hitting your head against a wall in terms of applying for a job, are people reviewing your application? Presumably you're a pretty good writer, right? But it can still be useful to have people like take a look at stuff. Maybe this person has already done that, right? So you can also get feedback from prospective employers. you may kind of strike out here, but you can even ask people, hey, so I noticed that y'all went in a different direction. Can you help me understand what the person who got the job, what did they have or what did you like about them more than me, right? So what were y'all looking for that I was sort of lacking that someone else had? And you may not get any answer at all. You may get some vague answer like a cultural fit or things like that. And sometimes hopefully you'll find someone nice who will actually like give you some information, but you don't know until you ask. So you can even try to get feedback from colleagues, things like that. The other thing is when it comes to getting feedback, so if you have written for the LA Times, New York Times, HuffPo, you may know people there, right? So I would ask them and say, hey, I'm trying to get back into writing and like the job market seems super rough. Do you have any advice? This is where also kind of generic things, so networking. So this is where like, I think that if you are someone who is brilliant but has some kind of like yellow flag on your resume, right? So I think this person fits this really, really well, where solid right here. This is like, gold star level. And this over here is like kind of a yellow flag. So if you're someone like this is where you may, the emails and the resumes are not going to be your strongest showing, potentially, right? It depends on writing cover letters and things like that. So this is where like I'd really try hard to network, and people may be like, what is networking? We may do some videos about that or something like that soon. But this is where like, because ultimately what you want to do is develop human relationships, because human relationships are still really, really important in terms of like decision-making and who we hire, right? So this is where I'd consider like joining a professional organization. So people are like, what are the basics of this? Like join a professional organization. I know people sometimes hate this thing, but LinkedIn can be really good, right? So you like how is your LinkedIn profile? Like what's going on there? And this is where like just meet people. And this is where you don't necessarily want to, and so when people are saying, that's why I say join a professional organization, because a professional organization will have events that you go to and you try to like learn whatever you need to learn there, and you'll meet people as a result. Because I think the problem is that the email situation is where there's like, it's just 1,000 faceless applicants. So which faceless applicant who has the prettiest face in a pile of people without faces? Right? So that's the competition you've got. And if you're kind of non-traditional, like you want to meet people if you can. Last thing that I'll sort of say is that, if you are running into a brick wall, this is a little bit about feedback as well, but, we talked a little bit about getting feedback. So you can also use these connections in terms of networking. So if you know anyone at the LA Times, if you had an editor or something like that, even if it's been a couple of years, they may remember you. So I'd reach out to them, right? So pull on your network. And say, hey, like you were my editor for 1 or 2 years, or even if you've got relationships, so like if from people at school, like you can even email professors and stuff. You kind of ask them like, hey, this is the situation I'm in. What would you recommend? Last thing that we're going to talk about is running into a wall. So we talked about feedback, but I'm just going to give you all kind of a simple example. So let's say that I'm trying to date, and despite many dating apps and a couple of first dates, right? So tons of emails, few interviews, 1,000 emails, 10 interviews, 1,000 dates. 1,000 matches, 10 dates, 0 second dates. So this is why feedback is really important, because like sometimes the problem here is that like you've got body odor. Right? So there may be something going on that you're not aware of, but which is heavily, heavily influencing your outcomes, right? So I'm not trying to be insulting here, but like that's just the best example I can kind of think of, where there may just be something that you're missing. So like you just didn't realize that maybe, you've got some BO. And similarly here, there may be something in this process, either in the way that you interview or the way that you do your resume, like that you just aren't aware of. And it's not your fault. And this is the kind of thing where it's like, okay, just put on deodorant and the problem's fixed. It's not like, BO is just, it's what I thought of. I recognize it's kind of insulting in a sense, but This is the kind of thing where, like, having worked with people who have had body odor, having had body odor myself when I was like 13 years old and before I understood deodorant, this is like something that I struggled with, where I was like, oh my God, I didn't realize. Like, one of my friends was kind enough and was like, hey man, you stink. I was like, what is that? Because like, I didn't know, right? Like, I hit puberty and like my body started changing and I didn't really realize like that I smelled bad. And so then it's just something you got to learn, right? And I thank that dude. To this day, it's like one of the best pieces of feedback that I've gotten. So there may be some simple mistake you're making, but unless you ask people, like, you don't really know, right? So just to kind of summarize, it's unfortunately very common that people used to be successful and now they're not. So if we look at these people, like, the general profile is that they're told from a young age, oftentimes, that they have all these talents and gifts. And sometimes what they do is they hit a wall in terms of like school or college where they never develop study habits. So they like go from straight A's to like C's and then F's and then don't know what to do. But what's just as common or even more common is that we end up with this sort of situation where they're actually successful, right? So they have prestigious accomplishments and things like that. Totally fine. And then something happens where, unfortunately, they move from fertile soil and lots of progress to barren soil, where even though their skill as a writer or gardener is the same, the results that they get start to change. And when the results start to change, they start to lose self-esteem. Because when it comes down to self-esteem, we get our self-esteem from the outside world or inside world. And it's not even self-esteem. Their sense of esteem comes from external accolades. And when you take the external accolades away, your esteem goes with it. So this is where you need the process of sort of discovering self-esteem, right? You never needed to before because the rest of the world told you how awesome you are. So you never needed self-esteem. So how do you do that process? You start by actually deconstructing your old sense of esteem. When I thought I was the hottest shit in the world, where did I derive that sense of value from, right? Where does my value come from? And hopefully through that process, what you'll sort of discover is that the LA Times doesn't make you a good writer, but it's that because you were a good writer that the LA Times picked up your stuff to begin with. So the value is inherent in your work, and it's just the external world that sort of gave you the approval. And once you sort of figure that out, then you can approach things with confidence. And when you go into interviews, the limbic response that limbic means emotional. Limbic system is what governs our emotions. The emotional response people are going to give to you in interviews, if you're confident in yourself, since you've done that work, since you've developed some self-esteem, is going to be very different and allow you to sort of succeed more. A couple of other practical tips, if you're running into trouble sort of moving forward, you can always get feedback, right? Ask people to review your applications, maybe even feedback from employers. You can reach out to old connections and sort of share your situation with them and see if they have any suggestions, see if they know anyone who's looking for a writer, because a personal recommendation goes a long way. You can join professional organizations or do stuff on LinkedIn related to networking. I know people are like, networking. The truth is sometimes it matters. And why is that? It's because if you're sort of a non-traditional applicant or you've got a yellow flag because you haven't been writing for the last 4 years, the email application is not going to be the best way to showcase who you are and put your best foot forward. So that's why in-person stuff matters more. You need people to look past some of these things in your application to recognize that there's someone really valuable underneath. And that happens in person. Questions? Yeah, so also feedback, right? So I'm doing well. What if there's not somebody valuable behind the CV? That's exactly my point, is that your sense of value is not determined by the CV, right? So this is where, I believe all human beings have value. I think each and every one of you has something to contribute to the world. And I didn't come to that conclusion just because I'm like try to be a good person and see the positive. I genuinely think that. So let me like make a case for a second. So if we think about the contributions that people come up with, let's talk about innovation, for example. So innovation requires a certain set of experiences to happen, right? So if we think about the Wright brothers, there's a certain constellation of experiences they had that created the opportunity for them to invent the airplane. You can't have the Wright brothers today because the airplane's already been invented. That boat has sailed. And if that's sort of true, what that means is that each and every one of you has a completely unique circumstance, right? You have a completely unique set of experiences, background, the times you live in today, the age you are, what you've done, what you haven't done. Your experiences and the neurons in your brain are capable of creating something that is statistically impossible for someone else to make. Because no one else knows exactly what you know and has lived exactly what you've lived. And when we think about innovation and where like understanding and stuff comes from, it's like from what we've learned, right? So if I've read these 10 books, I'm able to form these 10 conclusions. If I've read a different 10 books, I will come to different 10 conclusions. And so this is the key thing, and this is what I sort of figured out in my life is like, you know, like my contribution to the world is based on the opportunities that I was given. And the same is true for all y'all as well. And you may think like, oh, but what can I possibly contribute? All I do is, you know, playing games all day. And like, I'm someone who failed out of college because I was grinding Diablo 2 and Warcraft 3. And like, I still found a contribution, and so can you. Right? It's just thinking a little bit about like I really do believe this. And this is why like, even when we kind of talk a little bit about, you know, people who come on stream, each person who comes on stream has a unique perspective. And what we do is like share that perspective. And we can all benefit from it, right? Okay. Should we move on? Complex One is saying, I'm so grateful for this channel. We're grateful for you too, Complex One. Sounds like you're pretty complex. We need complexity. We need nuance. Okay? All right, shall we move on? Got a couple of other ones. All right. Uh-oh. No. I really got to lock my scenes. GG. Okay. I feel like I am a child in an adult's body. I would like to begin and start that I've had a hard time debating whether or not I should make a post. Really glad you did. If Rich P is out there listening to this, I'm very glad you made the post. I feel that my issues, problems are in a way inferior compared to other people my age. Have we heard that before? I'm 19 years old and I'm a little behind on education, which wasn't my fault as the college messed up my application, which leads me to being in a class with some people being 3 years younger than I. I haven't had a job yet, nor have I had really any adult experiences. And this makes me feel embarrassed and ashamed if, for example, what I'm doing in my life right now. And yes, I have an anxiety disorder of some sort, realistically GAD, self-diagnosed. We'll get to that in a second. My point is, I fear this adult world. I don't see it I don't see almost worth living. I felt suicidal for some periods and depressed, and I'm not satisfied with my life. I've used gaming, for example, to escape this reality, but as the older I get, the closer I feel to this impending doom. However, I recently learned that I have another way that I escape reality. I invest into other people. Basically, I've been dating women from time to time, and I suppose not wanting to be alone. I'm someone very passionate, and unfortunately, it's a weird way to word this, but I kind of direct my passion towards the other person and invest time into them. Sadly, this is unhealthy for me and also most likely for them too. The idea of having a job scares me in general, especially with my lack of skills in anything practical. But not only that, I don't think I would be practically beneficial to the workplace because I have this separate kind of physical anxiety that works a bit like a panic anxiety, but also pretty much subconsciously present, which I don't really want to get into. Okay. I've always wanted to feel like being saved, but that someone would basically help me get stuff done. This is kind of embarrassing to talk about. I've always felt alone and that I have nobody to talk to about these things. I'm not close to my parents. People I've been close to are now busier than because life and they grew up and I haven't. I lived almost the same way for a long period of time now, and I feel like I need to do something about it, but I feel paralyzed. It's like there's always a but. I'll gladly appreciate any advice and thank you for reading. So thank you for posting. There's a lot of good stuff in here, okay? So sometimes in life, we fall a little bit behind. We start to feel that we're inferior to people around us. We start to feel like we kind of screwed things up. And then something else can happen where we start to lose hope in the world. We start to feel like maybe life isn't worth living. Sometimes that gets to the level of having some suicidal thoughts, maybe feeling depressed. And something else can happen as well, which is that we start investing in other people instead of working on ourselves. So what energy we do have goes towards benefiting others instead of pulling us up. Because when we start to invest in ourselves, what tends to happen is like something gets in the way, right? We sort of feel like, but I don't feel like doing this. And we don't really feel capable of helping ourselves. And then we even can start to fantasize that given how bad my situation is, given how long I've been in this situation, the only hope for salvation is to get someone to help me, right? Because I can't do it myself. So how should we understand this, right? Because this is like a really, really important post. So the first thing that I want to talk a little bit about is this whole business of self-diagnosing generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, suicidal ideation, etc. So this is the kind of thing where, you know, if you're trying to do something in life and you feel like some stuff like this is getting in the way, you should absolutely go get a mental health evaluation. So if people are trying to figure out, like, so just I'll share some basics about this, okay? So how do you know whether someone has an illness or doesn't have an illness? As a clinician, how do you decide, okay, is this like just the emotion of anxiety, or does this rise to the level of generalized anxiety disorder? And the key thing, the key hallmark of all psychiatric diagnoses is impairment of function. So when it starts to affect your life, when it starts to get in the way of things, that's the threshold of a disorder. Being sad is not clinical depression. Even being some degree of hopeless is not clinical depression. The threshold of clinical depression, and that's major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, there are all these different diagnostic criteria. But the key thing that we look for is like, is it actually a disorder? Is it disordering your life? Is it impairing your function? And so if you're someone who's kind of stuck and you think you may have something going on and you're struggling to move forward, the first thing to recognize is like, get that evaluated and hopefully fixed. So mental illness is no different from physical illness. It's like, oh, I have trouble riding my bike and I'm afraid that my leg may be broken. And it's like, what's the first piece of advice you would give that? Well, like maybe you need to like not have a broken leg because that's going to fundamentally impair anything that you try to do. Right? So if you're in this kind of situation, in the strongest way possible, like please go get a mental health evaluation, right? It's their job. It's not your job to self-diagnose GAD or depression or anxiety or suicidality, right? So if you're also having suicidal thoughts, like go see a mental health professional because they're there to figure out, okay, you do have GAD, you don't have GAD. Oh, maybe you have this thing and you never even realized. So I've had like patients that I've worked with that, you know, think they're depressed. And what it turns out is they have like hypothyroidism. We just start them on thyroid medication and like their problem is literally fixed. As long as they take their levothyroxine, their mood is perfectly normal. It's because they actually have a hormonal deficiency, which is measurable through a lab test. So this is where the first thing you should do if you're concerned about this stuff is go see an actual like licensed professional. That being said, there are a couple of other things that I'd like to talk about. The first is this idea of being behind, right? And feeling like a child. So let's talk for a moment about, you know, what does it mean to be an adult and what does it mean to be a child? And then the next thing that we want to talk a little bit about is like, as we start to feel inferior and lose faith in ourselves, like how does that affect our ego? How does that affect the way that our mind works? And why do we invest into other people? And the last thing is like, just generally speaking, thinking about how to move forward from here from sort of a life perspective. So first thing that I want to talk about, ask you all this question, is what's the difference between an adult and a child? How do you become an adult? Right? So oftentimes, an adult is in essence a legal designation, right? So we say, for example, in the United States, that when you're 17 years old and you've been on this earth for 17 years and 364 days, you are a child. You are a minor. And when you've been on this earth for 17 years and 365 days, you become an adult. What do y'all think about that? Right? So at least in the US, like even being an adult is like sort of a weird, fluid thing. Can you join the army at 18? Yes. Can you buy a bottle of beer? No. Right? So we even delay some of the aspects of adulthood till 21. Even in the United States, for example, I think you can be on your parents' health insurance. So as a child, you can be on your parents' health insurance until like the age of 26 or something. I don't know the exact number. So when it comes to like the faculties of adulthood, like 18-year-olds, like maybe they need to start filing. I don't think you even necessarily need to file taxes. Maybe. I don't know the details on that. But if we really think about all of the faculties of an adult, like they don't magically, it's not like if you're 19, you're like, sure, you may be like legally designated as an adult, but biologically, you know, you're not that different from a 18-year-old or 17-year-old. This is where if we talk about, I've seen some people sort of mention this. So frontal lobe development is a really good example. So we have this part of our brain called the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are the part of our brain that plan and execute tasks. So when I think about like, oh, I need to get a job, that can be overwhelming for some people. And as we get older, as we get mature, so there's also this like aspect of maturity, right? What's the difference between an adult and a child? It's maturity. Well, is a 18-year-old as mature as a 28-year-old? No, right? We all sort of know that. So what does that mean, maturity? So like we all understand it instinctively, but practically what maturity boils down to in a neuroscience perspective is like frontal lobe development. That's the simplest. It's an oversimplification because you can't boil anything down when it comes to the brain. But, you know, simplification is that if you think about maturity, a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 35-year-old will all be different levels of mature. And what's different between a 25-year-old and a 35-year-old? It's the development of the frontal lobes. So what are the frontal lobes there for? What do they do? The first is that they plan and execute tasks. So when someone says something like, you know, I've lived almost my exact same way for a long period of time. I feel like I need to do something, but I feel paralyzed. It's like there's a but, there's something getting in the way. Like the inability to initiate tasks could have to do with the frontal lobes. So the frontal lobes are what like break down tasks and like get us to do stuff. So like when I'm 19, it's harder to do the dishes than it is when I'm 29. Simple example, right? Not precisely true. There may be some people who it's very easy to do at 19, maybe harder when you're 29, right? So, but generally speaking, like it's easier to do stuff the older that you get when it comes to like boring crap. And why is that? It's because the frontal lobes also govern impulse control. So our susceptibility to impulses, if you think about a 14-year-old versus a 24-year-old, what's different? The 14-year-old is more impulsive. A 4-year-old to a 14-year-old, the 4-year-old is more impulsive. So the ability to initiate the right kind of behavior as well as restrict the wrong kind of behavior is all governed by the frontal lobe. Now, here's the thing. The frontal lobes finish developing around the age of 30. I personally believe there's no science behind this. I personally believe that frontal lobe development is being delayed in our society. So what I'm noticing, and this could be a selection bias, so this may just be the people that I end up seeing and talking to, is that like frontal lobe development is like getting a little bit delayed. That the independence that we used to see 100 years ago from an 18-year-old is less than the independence that we see from 18-year-olds today. There's no data to support that. There may be data. It's not something I've seen. It's just an observation, an anecdotal observation. I suspect that we may be delaying frontal lobe development. We may actually be fully delayed around 32, 33, 34, actually. All right, so I know in my experience, like I wasn't a real adult until like I was like 30, to be honest. That's when I really started becoming an adult in a lot of ways. So the first thing to understand is that if you feel like a child in an adult's body, like that's sort of true. There isn't, a child and adult is not binary. It's not like suddenly on your 18th birthday, legally, sure, you become an adult in that moment, but biologically, like there's no difference, or I mean, there's a tiny amount of difference, right? There's just, your neurons are 1 hour different between 17 and 18. It's not like some magical transformation that's binary from child to adult. Your brain is basically the same when you're 17 years and 364 days old and 17 years and 365 days old, right? The brain is basically the same. So cut yourself some slack. Recognize, first of all, that it's like, you know, being an adult is not, it's not like you're magically become an adult, like biologically, neuroscientifically, at the age of 19. The next thing to understand is that people have their own developmental pace, right? So life actually, I mean, sometimes we think of life as a race, but people just develop differently, right? So some people start puberty at like 10. Some people start puberty at like 14. People just have, like biologically, like our biological clocks are not all the same. Some people will start to have gray hair at the age of 28. Some people will have gray hair at the age of 58. Our biological clocks are just unique based on our genetics and environmental factors and all kinds of stuff. And that's true of our developmental trajectory as well. Like not everyone is 100% focused and has fully developed frontal lobes at the age of 21. Like some people have very highly developed frontal lobes at the age of 21. I was not one of those people. And that's okay. So now, so that's sort of a quick segment about like, if you're 19 and you feel like you're a child, like you may be in some ways, and that's actually perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that you're doomed for the rest of life. So where do people get this idea that now I'm screwed? So this comes from comparison, right? So this is what happens when we start to feel bad about ourselves. Our mind's ego activates. So when I start to feel inferior, that's an emotion that I experience, or shame, let's say. And then our ego activates, and our ego starts to make comparisons. This is sort of the Vedic model of the mind. The tricky thing is that the comparisons that we make sort of reinforce our feelings. So I'll give you all just an example that I tend to use fairly often, which is, you know, if I've just been dumped by my girlfriend, and I'm feeling bad about myself at 2 in the morning, what am I going to do? I'm going to log on to her Insta and see all the pictures of her having fun with other people. I felt bad about myself before, and my mind is going to seek confirmatory things outside of that, right? And then if there's a picture of her with another guy, my mind is going to make all kinds of comparisons, right? What the hell is going on there? Like, why does it torture me, right? Why do our minds torture us with anxiety, with these kinds of things? Because that's what sort of the function of the ego. The ego is looking to make sense of the world, right? So the way that I feel needs to be mirrored in the outside world. So if I'm feeling a little bit insecure and I'm like, oh, I want to believe I'm attractive. I want to believe I'm attractive. I want to believe I'm a good person. Let me turn to the outside world to give me that confirmation because I don't believe it for myself. The problem is that there are all kinds of things that you are good at, right? Like, so any 19-year-old, like, sure, you may be a couple years behind in terms of schooling and stuff. Sounds like it actually wasn't your fault because someone screwed up an application. But your mind doesn't think that way, right? Like, mind doesn't think that way. That's not what it does. When you're sort of feeling bad about yourself, your mind doesn't try to come up with reasons to convince you you're a good person. It actually does the opposite. It seeks out stimuli and makes comparisons that reinforce what you already believe about yourself. And then what happens, like, so now let's talk a little bit about if you're someone who invests in other people instead of yourself. So once you feel behind, once you feel like you're inferior, once you feel like you're a child in an adult's body, right? So like you should have grown up by now, but you haven't. And you're afraid that you never will. Are you worth investing in? Are you worth effort? What's going to happen to effort that you put into you? right? What's going to be the return on investment, the ROI, if you work on yourself? If you believe that you're inferior and you're a man-child and you're behind and you're surrounding yourself by you're surrounded by 16-year-olds, what happens is the mind naturally sort of concludes, right? Because you're like kind of not, you can't fix yourself. Like it's never going to be enough. So what do you end up doing? You invest in other people, right? Because they're worth saving. If I try to help someone else, like they can actually achieve something, but I can't. And so then what happens is you start directing your energy towards other people. And sometimes in the worst cases, you even start living vicariously through them. No, you absolutely should apply for that job. You should do it. You should do it. You should do it. Don't be a wuss, right? Take chances. I have faith in you. And you push them because you're trying to solve a problem in here. But this problem is unfixable because I'm a child in an adult's body. GG. GG no re. Go next. But not for you. Now I'm going to observe. I'm going to watch my friend play and I'm going to tell them what to do. Because I'm hopeless. So that's where we see that kind of behavior come from. And now we get to this part. Right? Which is... yeah. I've always wanted to feel like being saved and that someone would basically help me get stuff done. So where does that come from? And that comes from the same place as helping other people, which is that investing in myself is going to be insufficient. That's why I have to invest in other people, because it's like waste of time, because like the ROI is way too low. Right? So then what do you need? You need someone else to save you because you can't save yourself because you're a child trapped in an adult's body because you should have grown up by now because you should be smarter. You should be more capable. You should not be so lazy. You shouldn't be paralyzed to action. So you need some savior. And that's what you look for because you don't believe you can save yourself. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because where are you investing? You're investing in other people. Is someone going to come along and save you? Maybe if you're lucky, maybe yes, maybe not. But as you stop working on yourself and you start investing energy in other people, you sort of propagate this idea that the only person that can save you is someone else because you're not trying to save yourself at that point, right? You've given up on yourself. So that becomes true. And then like logically, like it becomes consistent and you start to believe it. Oh, see, like no one has showed up yet and I'm still in this situation, therefore I can't fix it. It's kind of tricky. It's very tricky. And it all comes down to the ego, right? It all comes down to this perception that I am a child in an adult's body. It all comes down to this idea that since I'm in this state, I'm screwed. Whereas the simple truth is that you're not screwed. The simple truth is that you are in this situation, chances are, because of some contribution of yours or lack of contribution of yours. That you invest all of your energy in helping other people and then you wonder why you're still there. And of course you need to be saved by someone else. Right? Like if my house is on fire and someone else's house is on fire and I spend all of my water putting out their fire, I need someone else to put out my fire because I'm not putting out my own fire myself. Do I have the water? Yes. But I'm using all my energy externally. And so this kind of becomes a cycle. So what to do about it? The first thing, and this is why we kind of started with the brain stuff, is to recognize that this perception that you are a child in an adult's body is false. It's like not a real thing. So are you behind other people your age? Sure. But you're also ahead of other people your age. Right? Like statistically, there are going to be 19-year-olds who like dropped out of school like 5 years ago. There are going to be 19-year-olds who, it sounds like you're in relationships from time to time. There are going to be 19-year-olds who have never been in a relationship or never date and don't even try to help other people. But does your mind compare you to them? No, of course not. That's absurd. Right? The mind only makes the comparisons that it needs to reassure itself of what it already believes. And so this is sort of like a tricky situation, but it's like totally okay because people development, just biologically, people develop at different ages. It's like not all the same. And it's not even necessarily that there's evolutionary advantage to developing early. Like, I don't know that that's true in any shape or form. In fact, if you kind of look at people having different developmental ages, that probably suggests that there's a selection within that window, but like whether you hit puberty at 10 or 14, there's really no selection pressure over one over the other, right? You could sort of assume that, but that also I'm not 100% sure. There may be people who are experts on the evolution of adolescent development that disagree with that and know more about that than I do. So what do you do about this? The first is to recognize that all of this stuff is like a conclusion that your mind comes to without necessarily being true, right? That you believe that you are a child in an adult's body, which is like, it's totally fine to be exactly where you are. There's nothing wrong with you. Could you do things better? Sure. Could you work a little bit harder? Maybe. Are you a little bit too paralyzed? Possibly. I'm not saying that you're perfect, right? But you are where you are and you're not fundamentally busted. Second thing is, especially in the case of real clinical mental health issues, if you do have generalized anxiety disorder or suicidal ideation or things like that, and like those are active clinical illnesses that you're experiencing, that can explain a lot of this stuff. And it's amazing. I mean, I don't prescribe antidepressant medication to all of my patients with major depressive disorder, but like for some of them, it just works amazing. Like it transforms their life. They live like normal people afterward, right? That we see that sometimes with antidepressants, generally. Your mileage may vary. Absolutely, you need to talk to your doctor about that. That's the whole purpose behind having a doctor, right? Is that they can make a tailored, individualistic determination about what your needs are. The last thing is to recognize this whole thing that as long as you keep investing in other people, like you need to really think about, why do I not feel like investing in myself? It's good to help other people, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying stop helping other people, but why do you think you can't invest in yourself? And really explore that. Try to figure out, why do I believe that I'm not worth investing in? Which is what I sort of read between the lines of this post, is that I'm not worth investing in. And the other magical thing that will happen is once you sort of explore that, hopefully you will start investing in yourself. And once you start investing in yourself and you start to see progress, you will realize that you do need to be saved. And you are actually right. The only difference, the only thing you didn't realize, is the person who needs to save you is actually you. You're the one who's going to do the saving. And once you come to that realization, then like life is a wide open field. Then you're empowered. Then you can do what you want, right? Because you're the one who saved you. You're the one who actually had the power to do it. You want to get some help along the way, totally all for that, right? Maybe sometimes you do need help, especially if there's clinical stuff involved. That's where like, you do need someone to potentially save you. To just think through it a little bit, right? Don't be quite as judgmental. Recognize that people move at their own pace. Like, life is not a race. People develop at different paces. The brain continues to develop until 30, 32, maybe. And so it's okay to be a little bit behind. Because the other interesting thing about life is, like, I think Rested XP, speaking of MMOs, is a really good analogy. So if you've been like AFK for a while, you actually catch up faster than people who regularly progress, right? And there's a really good general piece of evidence about this, which is immigrants. So like when immigrants move to a different country, if I move to a different country, if I move to the United States from India when I'm 9 years old, I know nothing about American customs. And so those kids have a 9-year head start. But by the time I'm 18, we are completely caught up. Exactly the same. I understand American culture just as well as someone who spent 18 years there. It's kind of like Rested XP. Like, the human brain catches up, right? That's what it's designed to do. So even if you've fallen behind, it doesn't mean that you're going to stay behind. And so invest a little bit in yourself. I'm not saying stop helping other people. Go get a clinical evaluation if you need to, or if you're even considering it. If you've self-diagnosed yourself with something, you should absolutely go get a clinical evaluation. And you may be surprised at who ends up doing the saving. You have 20 years of Arrested XP. Hey, trust me, dude, I had like 23 years, 22 years of rested XP. Absolutely. Like now the problem, you guys want to know the real tragedy? My situation? My rested XP is gone now. No more catching up. Right? Now it's the end game grind. Hours and hours of work for such little yield. All right, we're going to take a quick break. I need to go pee. I'll be back in a second. Why don't y'all think about questions for a second, and then we're going to try to do one more, okay, before we wrap up. Alrighty. How y'all doing? You did make it in time, net error. Okay. So, I did wash my hands. Let's do one more, and then maybe we'll do some simple meditation today. Okay. Okay, this is going to be tricky. All right, let's take a look. So, the world just seems so doomed, I don't understand why I should do anything with a long-term benefit. COVID's been ravaging the earth for over a year with no end in sight. Climate crisis is an inevitability that no government is even acknowledging. Wealth inequality is growing more and more. None of my friends will ever own a home or start a family. Every day I think about how either climate crisis will kill me or I'm going to kill myself because every day will be so unbearably horrible. So if you are actually having thoughts about hurting yourself, you should absolutely go see a licensed mental health professional or even call emergency services if you feel like you're in danger. Why should I keep going to school? Why should I eat healthy, work out, or save for retirement? Why is everyone pretending that things are going to be okay when they've only gotten worse year after year? So when I read this post, what I sort of hear is the existential plight of a generation, right? So like, there's a lot of bad stuff in the world right now, right? And that's what this person is kind of talking about. They're talking about climate change. Climate's screwed. COVID's bad. Wealth inequality is bad. No one's doing anything. None of my friends will ever own a home or get married, right? Is that what they said? Get married or have kids? Or start a family is the phrase that they used. And so sometimes, like right now, especially, like the world can seem like a pretty hopeless place. So how do we deal with hopelessness, right? So the first thing, once again, is, if you're actually having suicidal thoughts and stuff, you should absolutely go see a licensed professional. But I want to talk to y'all a little bit today about why should I bother? That's the main post, right? So let's talk about that. So the first thing we're going to do is sort of, I want to map out actually before we go to this, how we're going to talk about this. So there's a subtle thing that's going on in the mind here, which I want to try to illustrate. It's very, very tricky. But we're going to walk through literally like what happens in the mind, or I mean, we don't really know 100% for this person, but when I've worked with people who are like doomers, what I've discovered is that there are actually some unusual things that are going on in the mind, which actually can be worked on, that can lead to some degree of hope and positive improvement. And the reason that people don't sort of realize that is because they don't really acknowledge what's happening in their mind. All they're aware of is the output of the mind. So they see what the mind produces, but they don't see what is happening on the inside. So it's kind of like I've got a projector, and the projector is displaying a particular thing. But what's going on in the projector? I have a monitor that is displaying a particular thing. But what's going on in the CPU? What's going on in the hard drive? And it's my hope that by illustrating this, some of y'all may be able to get some degree of benefit. Okay? So let's try to understand what's going on in the mind of this person. So the first thing that I kind of want to point out is that our mind does not always function optimally. So sometimes our mind is impaired. Can you all hear that, by the way? There's like some construction outside. Okay. And so this is where, like, when we think about, how to approach this, first thing that we want to do is, like, if you are having suicidal thoughts or things like that, I think clinical intervention is completely appropriate, highly recommended. Because in the case of someone who is suffering from clinical depression, like, hopelessness is one of the 9 features of clinical depression. So if you have this kind of intractable hopelessness, which I've seen as a psychiatrist, that's the kind of thing that, you want to really get evaluated and sort of get treatment for. Because as long as, like we sort of mentioned earlier, it's really hard to run a marathon with a broken leg. Like, people are out there trying to run marathons and thinking about training regimens and how much do I need to work out and what do I need to eat. But sometimes if you got a broken leg, like, carbo loading before the marathon is not what you need to be focused on. So if you're feeling truly hopeless, if you are having suicidal thoughts, please go see a licensed professional. That being said, there's also some other things that we can do. We can teach about what is happening in the mind. So the first thing that I kind of want to point out is that I factually disagree with some of these statements. And it's not so much about who's factually correct or incorrect. I'll talk a little bit about how I disagree. But the more important thing is not who is factually correct, but the fact that the mind produces these thoughts. Okay, so let me illustrate. So the first thing is COVID has been ravaging the earth for over a year with no end in sight. I don't know if I actually agree with that statement. So as a medical doctor, I think vaccines seem to be doing, actually, generally speaking, like a really good job. So I know that there are some countries, for example, that have lifted all restrictions. Sometimes hospitalizations are still quite high, but the hospitalizations are in unvaccinated people predominantly. Like life is returning to normal in some ways. So I personally, so this is not, with no end in sight, actually, it's not factual now that I think about it. My opinion, I disagree with the opinion that there's no end in sight. I personally believe that the end of COVID, it may be like a persistent disease that we have to deal with, but I don't think that the ravaging the earth that it's done for the past year will continue. I think human beings will adapt, and hopefully there won't be further mutations and things like that. Maybe famous last words. So the other thing that we sort of consider is that Delta was both more virulent and more damaging of a variation, a mutation, whereas Omicron has a higher amount of virulence, but is like less damaging, right? So Omicron spreads very, very rapidly, but then is like has a lower lethality rate. I'm pretty sure that that's consistent with the research. Doesn't mean that it isn't dangerous or isn't lethal. It just means that it's like less lethal than Delta based on the data I've seen, which I'm not an expert. I'm not an ID person. I don't read all the studies. So take that with a grain of salt. So the other kind of thing that we can think about is like, lots of stuff was canceled last year. Whereas like now we're starting to have esports tournaments again and things like that. So in Dota, for example, they canceled the major, and we have regional finals that are online tournaments, but there is going to be an in-person major happening, I think, in Stockholm for the second major. So I think it's like we're starting to see the end, actually. So also, climate crisis is an inevitability that no government is acknowledging. So the crisis is here. I personally agree with that, but I wouldn't say that no government is acknowledging, right? So I think governments are acknowledging to different degrees, taking action to different degrees. Are they doing a lot? Are they doing a little? I'm not an expert. I don't really know, but I think that the black and whiteness of this statement, and this is what I really want you all to understand, this statement is very black and white. This statement is very black and white. I disagree with that black and whiteness. Wealth inequality is growing more and more. Agree with that. None of my friends will ever own a home or start a family. So I can't really see the future. I don't know if this person can see the future. But the only person who can make that kind of definitive statement is able to see the future, right? Because how can you know what will happen a year from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? And so the point that I'm making here is that, this is actually incorrect. I think factually disagree. I mean, it's my opinion, so I disagree. But I want you all to notice that there's a lot of black and white thinking here. This is the kind of thing where sometimes black and white thinking is consistent with actually having a clinical illness. So once again, go see someone if you fit this profile or you are this person. I'd strongly recommend you get mental health evaluation. But there's kind of more to it than that, right? So where does this black and white thinking come from? How can we sort of understand this? And the bigger question that I want to ask is, how does the mind come to its conclusions? Because this is really important to understand. Because what this person is saying is that since there is no chance of improvement, don't bother. Right? That's what this person is essentially saying. Why should I bother if like all this stuff is going wrong? And this is where I know it sounds kind of weird, but I don't actually think this is the right before after. So if we look at the way that the mind works, the mind will oftentimes come to a conclusion and then will actually reverse engineer the evidence. So what I think actually could be happening is not that since there's no chance of improvement, I shouldn't bother. But that this person, and sometimes when we feel, let's say, emotionally hopeless, and I'm not saying that this isn't influenced by what you consume in terms of media and stuff. Then what happens is that the mind looks for an excuse for inaction and then provides justifications. And why do I sort of think that this could be going on in this particular case? And it's because of the black and white thinking, right? Because the world is not black and white. The world is nuanced. No one can predict the future. COVID is actually getting better. I mean, I strongly believe that. And I think most scientists, like even, for example, Anthony Fauci, like is sort of saying maybe we're moving in the right direction, right? And he's been super conservative. And then other governments are actually like lifting restrictions like completely. It doesn't mean that there aren't still cases. It doesn't mean that it still isn't a dangerous disease. But like, I think kind of like people are sort of saying like maybe the end's in sight, okay? But this is the tricky thing, because if we really look at the mind, what it actually does is we'll come to a conclusion, usually emotionally, and then we'll like find justifications for it. And this is incredibly damning, because here's the thing that I want y'all to understand. If all these statements are true, COVID will last forever. Climate is screwed. No families. No houses. Therefore, I'm not going to act. So I want y'all to think about this. What would have to change for this person to act if this is the scenario that we're living in? What would have to change? Right? What would make it logical for this person to act? Why would this person bother acting? Right? So COVID would have to be finished. The climate would have to be fixed. Everyone would have to have families and houses. Wealth inequality would have to be fixed. Right? It's almost as if the mind is generating an impossible checklist. And as long as that checklist exists, we're not going to act. This is the impervious reason for inaction. Do y'all see that? Because if this is true, then there's like literally no point. And that's the way that the mind has been constructed. That's how the argument has been constructed by the mind. Right? Because you need, one person said, beautifully put, utopia will lead to action. So your mind has managed to create an impossible requirement for action. Now, why the hell would it do that? Because it doesn't want to act. Right? So I think what's actually going on is this. Because the scenario that's created over here is actually this. And so we see this a lot where like, you know, so how can I say this? The mind kind of justifies its beliefs, right? So if I'm, you know, this is unfortunate, but sometimes when someone has an affair, right, is unfaithful to their romantic partner, what they'll end up doing is making justifications. And they'll say, yeah, the reason I had the affair was because you were doing this. So the mind is trying to create some kind of concordance with like what's going on with the rest of the world. And so if you feel emotionally hopeless, what the mind is going to do is engineer something that allows you to not act. Because what it really doesn't want to do is act. And what I would imagine for this person is that taking any kind of action is going to be incredibly hard, right? And we kind of see this, like, why should I keep going to school? Why should I eat healthy, work out, or save for retirement? There's a lot of hopelessness here. What's like the primary emotion that you're feeling here is hopelessness. So then the question kind of becomes, okay, where does that hopelessness come from? And this is where I think that the person probably has like a really good point, that if we really look at the world, you know, all of these things are going to contribute to that hopelessness. So when I open up, you know, the internet every day and I see like more articles about COVID and more articles about wealth inequality, and this area of the world is screwed, and this area of the world is screwed, and this area of the world is screwed, like I'm going to feel hopeless. If there's a clinical element, right? Because remember that this person may have something clinical going on, that's going to contribute to that as well. So it's not just sort of what we feel internally. And then there could be all kinds of other experiences. I imagine that if we were to interview someone like this and we talked to them, what we would find is some degree of experiences in their life that may seem kind of small or insignificant, where like they were taught to not hope, where they gave up on hope because of who knows what happened. Maybe there was something that was actually abusive. Maybe a parent abandoned them. Maybe they were bullied. Maybe they have failed out of college. Maybe like, who knows, right? Something happens that results in this emotional hopelessness. And this is the sequence of events in the mind. Emotions happen first. Then our ego steps in, and the last is the intellect. And we kind of know this because when people are emotional, they are not rational. You can be emotional and rational at the same time, but generally speaking, people who are like thinking emotionally or leading with their emotions are like different from thinking rationally, right? We kind of view them almost as opposite ends of the spectrum. And so what I'm sort of seeing is that like this is the main thing to watch out for if you're kind of in a situation like this, is be careful about what your mind is setting up is the prerequisite to action. Because if your mind sets up utopia as the prerequisite to action, then you have an endless excuse to never act. Right? And so then the real question is, do you feel like acting? Do you want to act? No, you don't feel like it. I don't want to. And this is the beautiful thing, and y'all may, you may understand this really well, the 12% of you that are playing Lost Ark. When your mind wants something, it'll come up with whatever reasons it can to make sure you get it. Right? There are all kinds of reasons. Oh, man, I streamed for 2 hours today. It was so exhausting. I deserve a break. Let me play some Lost Ark. Or, I ate really good yesterday. I deserve pizza. Let me eat some pizza. But what came first? The acknowledgement of what you deserved or the desire for pizza? So once the mind wants something, be super careful about how it constructs reasons to justify what it wants. And once you construct those reasons, like just think about that for a second, right? Like what needs to happen in the universe for this person to feel obligated to act, for this person to feel inspired to act? The mind sometimes creates an unsolvable problem. Because if you have an unsolvable problem, you have an endless excuse to not act. And what your mind really wants to do is just sit there, right? I don't feel like working out. I don't feel like studying. I don't feel like doing this. And so that's super tricky. And be careful about the way that your mind works. Because if you find yourself in a position where your mind is saying, don't bother doing these things because of climate change, because of this, because of this, because of this, that's like very dangerous territory. Because I'd say that in a bizarre way, like the fact that this post is there sort of is suggesting, and this is where I, choose to be hopeful, is the planet screwed for eternity? Like maybe, maybe not. Like, I don't know. But one thing that I am hopeful about is that there's an awareness of our impact on the planet in a way that there has never been in, as far as I know, in the history of humanity. Certainly not during my lifetime. So like, I grew up in the 90s, and like no one, like people were talking about global warming, but it wasn't like, wasn't a big deal. So we're taking things seriously on a level that we haven't before. Like there's an acknowledgement that wealth inequality is a problem, right? So I'm not saying that it isn't getting worse, but I think people are like starting to get to a level where they're like really not okay with it, right? And that's when change happens. You have to have discomfort with something. You have to have dissatisfaction with something in order to actually change it. And so that's where like, I want to have some hope. And I think COVID is a good example that's actually given me some hope. Like we had a disease that we have not experienced in modern times, like that has torn through our society and like killed so many people and changed the way that we lived for like 2 years. And the other thing that happened is like humanity got behind it, right? Sure, some people, were kind of COVID is a hoax and whatnot. But generally speaking, there was a worldwide effort to produce vaccines that are effective and hopefully safe, right? So like generally speaking, it appears that the current data suggests they're safe. like humanity is never, medical science has never focused on a problem and friggin' fixed it this fast. At least that I'm aware of. People may make discoveries, like the discovery of penicillin was revolutionary, for example. But we've been looking for, vaccines for HIV and herpes for like decades, right? We still haven't found one. There are clinical trials for HIV, I think now, and herpes. But so I think that there's actually, like, when humanity gets behind something, like, we can do pretty well, right? So I am kind of hopeful for that. Am I worried? Sure. There are reasons to be concerned? Absolutely. So be a little bit careful about, first of all, the kind of stuff that goes into your mind, because the contribution of emotional emotional hopelessness can be, if you're not careful about social media exposure and things like that. There's studies that show that TikTok, Facebook, whatever, social media exposure at high levels leads to worsening mental health. And then if you start to feel kind of emotionally hopeless, definitely consider clinical evaluation, but also start to think a little bit about, pay attention to what's happening in your mind. Do you actually want to do any of that stuff? Because if the answer is, I don't actually want to do that stuff, and if you tunnel down, that's what you may find, the result will actually be that, your mind, be careful about what's the chicken and what's the egg. Because the mind loves setting up unsolvable problems to give you an excuse to not bother. Right? Because it's easy. Because now it's intelligent. Now it's justified. Now it's not hedonism or laziness or lack of discipline. It's useless objectively. And so then the mind feels good about itself. It gives you a good reason. Oh, yeah, it's okay. It's justification, right? It's okay to have an affair. Your partner's working late. So it loves to protect you. That's really what the mind is trying to do. It's not your enemy. It's actually a protective mechanism because it wants to save you from the hurt, right? Oh, you don't want to work? Oh, that's okay. That's okay, darling. You just stay home today. You don't need, no, yeah, the world is such a terrible place, my love. There's no point bothering. Yeah, you keep playing video games. You do that. Yeah. It's so hard out there. Yeah. Don't bother. I'm with you. I'll protect you. I'll give you lots of reasons to do exactly what you need to, because the mind works for us, right? So be careful about that. Okay, should we meditate for a couple minutes? Oh, yeah, copium. So y'all joke about copium a lot, right? I don't know that I buy into most of when y'all say copium, but this is actually copium of the highest magnitude. Like, these unsolvable problems that your mind creates are first-class copium, right? Oh, don't bother because the world has all of these things wrong with it. And I'm not saying those things aren't wrong with it. I'm not saying that, like, this person is foolish for being hopeless or anything like that. On the contrary, it's actually really, really well done, right? I completely understand where this person is coming from. It's easy to give in to that hopelessness. Doesn't mean that it's real, though. So what's going on? Like, what's controlling what? What's the chicken and what's the egg? Does the hopelessness come first and therefore justify inaction, or does the desire, does the circumstances of the world justify inaction, or does the desire for inaction and some kind of hopelessness create a system that justifies inaction? Right? So what comes first? The desire for inaction or the justification of inaction? All right, shall we meditate? Let's do some amount of Nadi Shuddhi or alternate nostril breathing, so we haven't done that. So I'll teach this again because we haven't done it in a while. This is the hand posture, right hand. You can kind of do the Vulcan salute. If you can't do that, just fold these two fingers. Sometimes people end up doing this. That's totally fine. So what we're going to do is, so hopium starts with meditation. All right, so what we're going to do is block this nostril with our right thumb, and we're going to breathe in through our left. So don't do this practice if you have a deviated septum, by the way. And we're going to switch, and we're going to block the other nostril with our other two fingers, and we're going to breathe out. Then we're going to breathe in through the same nostril. Switch and out. And in. Switch and out. Go ahead and sit up straight. Adopt a meditative posture. Spine straight. Breathe in. Switch and out. We'll do about 5 more rounds. In. Switch and out. In. Switch and out. In. Switch and out. In. Switch and out. In. Switch out. In. Switch out. In. Switch out. And now let's relax. Let your eyes remain closed. Notice the natural slowing of your breath. When you're ready, go ahead and come on back. Some people may notice that one of your nostrils feels clogged. That's actually totally normal. So our nose will one nostril will always be more open than the other. The other thing is that it tends to switch throughout the day. So it's okay. So hopefully y'all enjoyed some of that meditation. Remember, when we're feeling emotionally bad, we can always meditate a little bit. And sort of in the space of that stillness, even though climate change is real, even though wealth inequality is real, even though COVID is real, it feels a little bit more distant. And if we think about the problems in the world, they bear down on our mind. They become reality. Right? They fulfill our consciousness. And so we can take a step back from that. It doesn't mean that we're ignoring it. It doesn't mean that it isn't real, but we're sort of centering ourselves. And the more that we're able to center ourselves, the easier it is to actually do something about it. So I strongly encourage you all to meditate. I personally find alternate nostril breathing that we just did today to be a really awesome introductory practice. I don't know if y'all can tell, we were practicing for like 2 minutes. So ideally, you can get up to 20 minutes of practice. But even a few minutes here or there is a beautiful way to start. So who are we going to raid today? It's our last order of business. Pooper Noodle? Let's raid Pooper Noodle. All right. We'll raid Pooper Noodle. We'll see y'all maybe on Monday. Not 100% sure. Stay tuned to our socials. And have a good weekend. And hopefully, if y'all are into Dota, I'm looking forward to some good Dota. So take care. Love y'all.